I've been fortunate enough to go around to a lot of book discussions, had a lot of book signings, and one of the things that people will do when they come up close to me and they see this book, they'll look at the picture here, and then they'll turn it around and they'll look at this picture on the back, and then they'll look at me, and they'll look right here, and they'll look at these wrinkles, and then they're going to say, "That's not you, is it?" I said, "Yes, it is me." I said, "Give me credit for having been young once." But interestingly, what about your experiences with dangerous wild animals? So I kind of paused for a minute because I try to always put myself into the place of the questioner, and I'm thinking, oh golly, he wants me to tell about, I've had to knife fight a bear, I've had to fend off a tiger, I know what he's thinking, And so, but this is what I told him. I told him the most problems I've had with wildlife here in Putnam County are bald eagles. Okay, bald eagles run into electric power lines. They get run over by cars. They will chase prey into the ground and literally knock themselves out. He says, "Lieutenant, I'm up on Highway 17. I've got an eagle up here that's been hit by a car. I'm going to take it to the rehab." I said, "Great." I said, "Let me tell you how." He cut me off. He said, No, Lieutenant." He said, "You forget. I worked at the Jacksonville Zoo. I wrestled alligators and I wrangled pythons. I know how to catch a bald eagle." So I closed myself on taking comfort in Jamie, who had worked at the Jacksonville Zoo and wrestled alligators and wrangled pythons, could certainly catch a bald eagle. You know it's coming. 1 hour later, cell phone. It's Jamie. "Hey, what's going on?" "I'm in the emergency room." I said, "Well, let me guess. Your stint at the Jacksonville Zoo did not include working with birds of prey." He sheepishly replied, "Yes, sir. That would be correct." And so then I asked Jamie the question that any supervisor would ask. I said, "How bad was it?" And then he replied, "The talons went completely through my right hand." I said, "My, that must have hurt." He said, "Yes, sir, but that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was getting that darn eagle loose from the officers I worked with and the poachers we caught. And in one instance, I write a story about a poacher we didn't catch. And the reason I put that story in the book was because the true nature of law enforcement, it doesn't matter if you're a police officer or a sheriff's deputy or a game warden, is that a lot of guys get away. And I thought, well, if I could easily have written each chapter where we caught everybody, but that doesn't really reflect true law enforcement. And so I did include this one story about where this particular fellow gets away, but for those of you who've had read it or plan on reading the book, I think when you read this story, you'll understand why, because he was a real handful. And I also write about one of the biggest environmental busts in the state of Florida. That was when Amtrak passenger trains was dumping their poop upon unsuspecting anglers fishing beneath the Buffalo Bluff Railroad Bridge. Yes, it is true. This case took up 14 months of my life, beginning in early 1988 and ending in sometime in 1989. It was a true David and Goliath story. Goliath being the United States government thinly veiled as Amtrak and then supporting them to the tune of $600 million annually. David being myself, the lone investigator, and one young, fresh prosecutor recently graduated from the University of Florida. His name was Dennis. I also write about survival, mine as well as others. In my particular case, I'm going to shorten this way down for you. I was an 8-month rookie on patrol in the Ocklawaha River. Again, good backdrop for a Tarzan film. When my patrol boat suddenly sinks at midnight and I am left adrift on a 6-gallon gas tank going through a gauntlet of alligators. Interesting things happen. I am at the northern border of the Ocala Forest. There are no cell phones. There is no help. Nobody knows where I'm at. So that's just something those types of situations back then. There were a lot of game wars down the glades. They get stuck, and you're on your own. That's it. You got to find your way out. Also write about the mechanical deer, the gift that keeps on giving for dumb crook stories. It's probably some of the best, most fun moments of my life is to see somebody get suckered by a dummy deer constructed out of dried deer hide and stuffed with styrofoam. It was a really great experience, and I have a story in the book that kind of illustrates that, and I hope the readers get a few. And so finally, I'll write about tracking in the book. I was the lead man tracking instructor at the FWC Academy, FWC standing for Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. But when I decided to write this story, I decided to take it in a different tack than the reader might anticipate me doing. Because most readers, I think, would think that I'm going to write a story about tracking a deer or tracking foot impressions. But no, I've written a story, it's around the deer poaching case, about how we track tire tracks. And here in Putnam County, because of these old vacant subdivisions, which we have tens of thousands of acres of that are sparsely populated, crisscrossed by hundreds of miles of dirt roads that most motor graders have never touched, it's become kind of like a laboratory for us to experiment with tracking folks. And in this particular story, I tell about a technique that we have that enables us to follow a tire track that has seemingly vanished. Well, actually, that has vanished for all extent and purposes. In other words, it's been overed so much, it's gone. But we've got some techniques that we use that sometimes allow us to drive right up to the bad guy's front door. And when it does, that too can be a wonderful experience. So when I was deciding what stories to write, I wanted to have as authentic characters as I could in the book. And I have several. But probably one of the most real and colorful is a guy named Roger Gunter, who we were talking about earlier. The best, shortest way I can describe him is that he's a cross between a modern-day Daniel Boone and a fictional Crocodile Dundee. And I mean that literally. He's had more near-death experiences than most Navy SEALs. Okay, and so Roger and I first met him in 1977. I've chased him, literally. My officers have chased him, had high-speed boat chases with him, been in the woods against him on foot. I mean, it's like trying to get a hold of a wisp of smoke. That's kind of what it's like. One night he went in, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but he went in on a motorcycle to kill a deer with another guy. Things get pretty sketchy for everybody involved. And I'm able to show his point of view, our point of view, and I change scenes back and forth until we have a final resolution. And another night, it was a hell-bent for leather boat chase that another officer named Gator Banks and I have with him. I'm not going to give up the resolution of that story either, but I think it's worth reading. But as we're in this boat chase, though, I show you what I'm thinking, and then I show you what Roger's thinking. Because I've asked him, what were you doing? What were you thinking? And it wasn't always what I thought he was thinking. We're sitting there at midnight. We have a tip. We know that Roger's coming. We know he's out here. Somewhere, it's dark of the moon, monkey fishing. And Roger drives a very fast boat. He had an 18-foot skipjack with a 225 yaw on it. So we know we're going to have a boat chase with him if we can finally get close enough to have a boat chase. And so by 2 o'clock in the morning, Gator and I are talking. And I said, you know, Gator, I said, we knew that his truck and trailer were parked underneath the Rice Creek Bridge where 17 crosses it. Well, we can't see that from where we're at in the river. And we were worried that if Roger had gone up Rice Creek to monkey fish and he came back to that landing, we would never see him load out. And we also know that he never brings this machine back to his boat trailer. He's always going to hide it in the woods somewhere in the swamp. And so I told Gator, I said, somebody's got to check Rice Creek. Somebody's got to check it. I decided it would be me. I was a supervisor at the time. I said, I'll go check it. But I was really kind of reluctant because I knew if I went up and checked it and Roger came by, Gator would get in the boat chase and I'd miss out on it. And I freely admit to having some sporting blood. I really wanted to be in on the boat chase if we're going to have it. You know, my boat flipped up on its side because I had just hit the root ball of a submerged cypress tree. It flipped me up and it started to flip me over like that. And when it does, I go completely under the water. My headlamp stripped off my head and now everything's black. Now, and just before I went under the water, I can see the barely submerged trunk of an 80 to 90 foot cypress tree, and I can see it vibrate in the water just before I went under. And somehow or other, don't ask me how, the boat is somehow running along this tree. Now, I'm completely under the water now. The boat is about half sunk. I'm under the water. It's starting to rotate all the way over. If the boat rotates all the way over, I will be shredded like a piece of cheese. That's the only one brief thought I can have because all this took place in about a second. Somehow, I get all the way down the trail. I hit the underwater canopy where the branches are, and I must have hit a forked branch or something, because now it flips the hull back the other way, and suddenly I found myself half beached on the other bank. And I'm like, whoa! That's not what I said. But I'm thinking, I flipped the switches, there was that very satisfying hum of the water coming out. Okay, and then after about 20 minutes, I actually got it all pumped out, and the only damage was I was just completely soaked. Of course, this is summertime, so it doesn't really matter, you know. And I drive on out and meet Gator, and we're sitting out there in the dark, and here comes Roger, and then, And so, but some people say, why you're promoting poaching? Well, my point of view is, no, I'm not promoting poaching. I'm glamorizing a good story. I'm promoting a good story, okay? And even down there in Sanibel, of course, it was a little more lengthy, but I went into detail about the point of views and why I wanted him because of that, you know. And then but I mean, you could take, oh golly, I mean, you could take the Hatfields and McCoys, for instance. I mean, Dean King wrote the latest nonfiction book published on the Hatfields and McCoys. There's been many. Was written by Dean King. He's a very noted nonfiction writer. Well, was he promoting the butchery of the Hatfields and McCoys? Because they were literally psychopathic butchers if you study them. Okay,
Right.
They were. But the point is, it's a good story. It's conflict. Conflict makes a good story. If you don't have conflict, if you have a story. A lot of people get caught up like it's deer poaching. It's not real criminals. Like it. You can have, picture this, you can have a shoplifter, a deer poacher, and a serial killer. Pretend like we're on a pristine beach. They're all three walk down the beach. And what's left behind are these barefoot tracks. The quality of the tracks, it doesn't differ from one to the other. Now the size of the foot, the length of the stride, that differs. But as far as the quality of the track, track's a track. You see what I mean? It doesn't matter if the serial killer leads or a shoplifter. All right? It's about technique and strategy of how you're going to follow. What the typical relationship is, well, we might, you know, we're not friends, of course, and our conversations whenever we meet them probably are tense, okay? But there's kind of a mutual respect there, okay? So you kind of have to appreciate, if you have somebody you've spent months, years trying to catch, and they keep eluding you, you have to appreciate that ability. I'm sorry. But I'm sorry you did. So far, I've got all third-person stories from one end of the state to the other. And so my strategy was, when I lay out that table of contents, on the opposite side will be a map of Florida. And I'll have a little flag. Chapter 1 would be Live Oak. Chapter 2 is the Everglades. Chapter 3 is down in Fort Myers. Chapter 4 would be Lake Apopka. And so the folks could say, oh, wow, he's going all over Florida. You should come to Boswick. You'll get a kind of maybe a full
We need to hear Roger's stories.
Yeah, so you'll hear the other side from Roger. I'm not sure how we're going to do that one. I don't think in my mind, I don't plan for us to do what we did in Melrose. I think it's going to be more questions, and we just kind of tell short anecdotes and things like that, maybe. But I think you would find it interesting, though, if you came. If you decide to come, you need to come before 6 o'clock. It starts at 6. You should probably plan on getting there by 5:30, 5:45 latest.